The story I'm going to tell you today is really a story that stems from, lots of exploration and museum collections and surveys and the people that are behind it. So, I always think of myself as standing on the shoulders of giants. All of the research that I am able to do is really built on decades and generations of people before me who have gone to Madagascar and surveyed different parts, and oftentimes have brought back specimens, information, maps, all sorts of data that we have been able to take and compile together and make into the story to tell us more about how birds in particular have been able to really make use of the space. And I also want to acknowledge the people that I have directly worked with in this story, the students and the postdocs, the mentees, and as well as the mentors and my collaborators, especially those in Madagascar. I just want to acknowledge specifically Mary-Jeanne Rahalilelo and Steve Goodman, both of whom have spent the last 3 decades, more than the last 3 decades, surveying all the different parts of Madagascar and helped build up the resources that we've been able to use in our studies here. So this is a tremendous effort that um, I get to be the one who tells you the story today, but this is really the work of lots of different people. And before I go into my talk, I also want to stop here and read this acknowledgement that I helped put together recently at the Bell Museum. Museum, like many fields, are reconciling with their long history defined by our colonial past and trying hard to correct systemic biases. And so I'll just read this quickly to um, so that we can acknowledge the tremendous value as well as what we can do with these specimens. In aiming to document, preserve, and interpret biodiversity, the Bell Museum acknowledges the past histories and cultures from where the specimens originated. We are obligated to uncover and document the entirety of the history of these collections. We are committed to creating an environment that welcomes and empowers people from historically underrepresented and marginalized communities to have equitable access to the museum's resources. We continue our work to better understand the natural world, remember the past, and create a more equitable future. So, we've been talking a lot about birds in this as the subject of this talk. And as we talk about, I want to kind of pull back and talk about all birds before we talk specifically about Madagascar birds. And the question that I often get asked as an ornithologist is, how well do we know birds? How well do we know the avian tree of life? And as scientists, you probably know that birds are fairly well studied. We actually know a tremendous amount about birds compared to other animal groups like various insects, right? So we know that we have a pretty good sense of the number of species there are. And we also are really fortunate in birds that it's been easy to take on a lot of the modern technologies and bring it into the field of ornithology to study birds in new ways. And so if we use a measure like genomics, which is we're very much in the genomics era, and if we use that measure, birds are really well studied. These are statistics from a few years ago. I haven't been able to update this with more accurate numbers, but I will I will say that I think probably in terms of whole genomes, it's more like 2,000 or 3,000 species that we now have whole genomes for in birds. That's a tremendous amount. So about a third of all species of birds that we know have whole genomes sequenced for them. So that's an incredible amount. And there's a whole number of species where we have several genomes available for individuals within that species. And so some species we know really, really, really well. But what I think is also remarkable is this last number, the number of species that we actually have no genetic data at all, not genomes, no, not even a single species, single gene sequenced. And so that's about 3,000, and that number actually hasn't changed that much in the last couple of years. This is tremendous. It's about a third of all of bird species, and it tells us a lot when we think about the fact that birds are probably the most well-known of the animal groups. So, that kind of contrast of birds are the most well-known, but about a third of them we actually have no modern information for. And if we look at where these gaps are, we can see that a lot of the gaps are kind of in the same way that biodiversity is distributed non-randomly across the globe, the gaps are also distributed non-randomly. So this is a map showing you where different, sorry, species richness of birds across the world are. And as this might be a familiar graph to many of you, birds, like a lot of other animal and plant groups, are most diverse in the tropics, right? And so these are the red areas here. And if we look at the number of species that don't have genetic data, again, what lights up is the same tropical regions. And maybe this is because this is also the region that has, these are the regions that have more species. But if we look at the proportion that are unsampled, so if we take the total number of species that are in a particular area and look at how many of those don't have genetic data, we see that there's actually quite a tremendous bias in terms of the eastern part and the eastern tropics having much more unsampled, a much greater proportion of unsampled species, and in some cases, almost half of their avian, their avifauna has not been sequenced. And so that tells us that we're really missing a lot of information because of this tremendous gap in our global knowledge of species. And this can have a lot of downstream impacts when we're talking about global conservation and the how do we set priorities and needs across the world. So to orient you to the region I'm going to focus on today, here's a map, and Madagascar is this large island here off the coast of Africa. You might know it most famously for its lemurs, which are found nowhere else in the world. Madagascar is considered one of the biodiversity hotspots in the global biodiversity hotspots because of its unique endemic plants and animals that are found nowhere else in the world. I'm also interested in Madagascar because, as an evolutionary biologist, we also often look towards islands as natural laboratories or systems where we think that evolution might be happening faster and often in dramatic fashion. So, islands are isolated, and this means that often there are fewer species on these islands, and which might lead to a greater amount of resources, perhaps fewer competition, perhaps reduced predation, et cetera. And so this allows groups that are lucky enough to make it onto these isolated landmasses to be able to evolve often in dramatic fashion. So famously, Darwin's finches evolved all these dramatic bill shapes in response to the resources they were able to experience in the Galapagos, or the Hawaiian hiney creepers, which again, similarly, were able to evolve into really dramatic bill shapes and sizes and ecologies based on the resources that were available to them. Madagascar is also home to several well-known endemic radiations, meaning groups that have evolved dramatically in a certain area. For example, the lemurs started as a single ancestral population that likely got to Madagascar around 40, 45 million years ago, and have since evolved into more than 200 species that we know today. Similarly, groups like chameleons or various plants, here are baobabs to illustrate that, have similarly experienced that same dramatic evolution. So Madagascar, to start with its history, was once part of the supercontinent of Gondwana, and it originated as an island because of the breakup of Gondwana. Um, for the last 88 million years, it's been isolated since it for excuse me, 88 million years ago when it rifted from India, split off from India, and India kind of drifted off and crashed into Asia. Since that time, Madagascar has been an island. So it's one of the oldest island groups as well. And 88 million years ago is before we think the modern groups of birds and mammals evolved. So when Madagascar became an island, this is what the birds look like, right? So this is still the age of dinosaurs. We're still in the Cretaceous here. And we actually have a fairly um, fairly good knowledge of the non-avian dinosaur radiations in Madagascar. Things to note from just this selection here is that similar to some of their modern representatives, we have quite a lot of variation and different ecotypes represented in the non-avian dinosaurs. And one thing that is fun for me to acknowledge is also that several of the fossils that have been found recently are very important for us to understand the early evolution of modern birds. And so there's some very bird-like dinosaurs that have been found in Madagascar recently. But that's kind of the extent of my knowledge of non-avian dinosaurs. So I'm going to leave it at that and move on to modern birds, which happened several million years after the isolation of Madagascar. So, how did modern animals get there if they didn't get there when it first rif rifted from Gondwana? So, the famous evolutionary biologist G.G. Simpson also asked this question, and he asked it with mammals. He noted that Africa has this tremendous diversity of mammals, especially large mammals, and noticed that Madagascar does not have that. So what might be an explanation for that? And he came up with this model called the sweepstakes model, saying only a lucky few groups were able to win that lottery ticket that would help them raft on or take a cruise in a way across the Mozambique Channel and get to Madagascar. And this explains why there's so few groups that are related to animals in Africa. I love this cartoon because I think it really explains some of our pop culture as well. Every time I say Madagascar to a non-biologist, the first thing they think of is these cartoon series, the Madagascar movies, and I have to constantly explain that like the animals that are featured in those movies are not the animals that you actually see in Madagascar. But I think the people who made these movies must have seen Simpson's little drawing and kind of got inspired by that because they figured out a way to get these animals from that are, should be in Africa into Madagascar via New York City. So, the sweepstakes model is kind of interesting because it's like kind of explaining a very obvious thing that there are a lot fewer groups in Madagascar than they are in the mainland. But it doesn't explain why it was so hard to win that lottery ticket. And we've recently gotten more evidence for why that might be. And we think it's possible it's possibly because of ocean circulation and wind current patterns. So for the last several million years, the wind conditions have actually been blowing from east to west in the opposite direction, so into Africa, rather than from Africa into Madagascar. And so it makes it very hard for anything to raft into Madagascar passively in under those conditions. And so one of the reasons why these lottery tickets are kind of stacked against you is because of these wind conditions. But going back to the example of mammals, what we know is that all of the mammals that we see in Madagascar are represented by just a few lineages that were able to disperse to Madagascar. So all of the non-volant mammals, the ones that are not flying, are today we see about 250 species in Madagascar, and these are all the result of just 5 dispersal events from Africa. When you include bats, that adds about 28 independent colonizations. So still a very limited number compared to what is possible from what is represented in Africa. But what about the birds, right? So birds, like the bats, can fly. And what we see is a very different pattern than the non-volant mammals, right? So we see multiple lineages across the bird tree of life. This graphic is showing you all of the birds that are all modern birds on a phylogeny, and all of the arrows are pointing towards lineages that have Malagasy representatives. So the 2 colors represent in black lineages that got to Madagascar and were able to subsequently speciate or diversify. And the pink are lineages that are single species representative. So lineages that got to Madagascar and then just stayed as they were. Maybe diversified a little bit, but did not become multiple species. And what's interesting here again is we kind of have roughly equal numbers of groups that speciated versus not. And this allows us to use this as a model system to test some key questions in evolutionary biology, right? Some questions such as why do some groups diversify more than others? How do groups diversify? And can we predict how diversification might happen in common across groups? So we set out to look at some of these questions, and the first thing we asked was, how did birds diversify within Madagascar, right? So if there is kind of a predictability, then we can say maybe some groups just have a higher capacity to diversify in general, and so that's what might explain why some groups diversify more in Madagascar versus others, right? And so what we did was we plotted the speciation rate, which is the kind of rate at which new species form in the larger clade that the Malagasy lineages are found in. And so we calculated the speciation rate of the source clade, and then we plotted that against the number of species that are found in Madagascar. And what's interesting is we find that there doesn't seem to be a correlation of speciation rate to species richness on Madagascar. And in fact, what might be kind of counterintuitive is that we have a number of lineages where they vary tremendously in speciation rate, but regardless of what their speciation rate is, they haven't diversified. What's also interesting is that we find that the lineages, I don't know if you can see my arrow, I hope so. The lineages that are on the upper left corner, these are the ones that have diversified the most, tend to be the ones that have lower speciation rates in general in other parts of the world. So maybe there's something happening or allowing them to diversify more in Madagascar than they do in general in other parts of the world. And to give you a short introduction to some of these groups that I'll spend a little bit more time talking about, the group that has the highest diversity in Madagascar are the Vangas. And this is a group that only recently, with a lot of genetic data, were we able to really identify all the members of this group. They look quite different from each other, even though they share a common ancestor. All of the lineages all of the birds that have stars next to them are ones that were thought to belong to different families, completely different families, and now are known to be part of this incredible radiation. And so it just kind of expands the number of different birds that were able to evolve from a single common ancestor. And if that picture wasn't dramatic enough, I'm going to show you some pictures from my recent field trip of birds we collected from pretty much the same site. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variation. This is Calicus. Here's the blue vanga that has this incredible blue plumage, blue eyes, and blue bill. The boatbill vanga that has this really bizarre shaped bill that actually, if you can't see it so easily, but there is a little bit of space between the upper and lower jaws, and we don't really know how and why that might be advantageous. The Mysticornis, this is a bird that was thought to be a babbler. It's very much a terrestrial bird. Looks very different and acts very different from like all of the other vangas. Oops. And last but not least is this little Newtonia, which was thought to be a warbler because it looks like an old world warbler, but is actually a shrike-like bird like the other vangas. And this is the classic hook-billed vanga that has incredibly powerful hook bill that there are accounts of it. Most vangas are flycatchers, or eat insects, sorry, insectivorous, but they also are have the capacity to eat other things. So there are anecdotes of hook-billed vangas grabbing geckos and devouring them. And two members I did not have the luck to see because they were not in the forest that I was in. They don't occur there, but ones that I aspire to are the sicklebill vanga, which has this crazy long, thin curved bill that it uses to probe in wood. And the classic story there is that there are no woodpeckers in Madagascar, and so maybe these guys occupy that niche. And the helmet vanga, which is possibly the most dramatic songbird I've seen. Another example of just how much we still need to learn about Madagascar is the next largest radiation, the Bernieridae or the tetrakas. This is a group that was only discovered to be a family, an endemic family in the year 2000. And all of these species here were originally thought to be members of warblers, babblers, or bulbuls. And it turns out that there are actually no babblers in Madagascar. There is one bulbul that is very different looking and unrelated. And the warblers, there's no sylviid warblers, but there are um, other warbler in the larger group of warblers, there are others, but this is an endemic radiation. And so this was only possible with the use of DNA. And so we think that, like these examples, there are probably lots of other, there's potential for us to find more new things. So I just want to give you a bit of a introduction to some of the other birds that are found in Madagascar, just so that you have a sense of the avifauna before I go into more of the analyses of biogeography. Another amazingly dramatic representative of the Madagascar avifauna, which unfortunately is no longer around, is the elephant bird. These are birds that were related to ostriches and actually bigger, probably the biggest of the modern birds, and also laid the largest egg possible. Elephant birds were part of the rat-type group, so ostriches, emus, cassowaries, rheas. These are all large flightless birds that are isolated on land masses that were part of Gondwana. And the classic story of biogeography was that when Gondwana broke up, these large flightless birds were isolated, and that's how that's how they speciated, that's how they diversified. But the more current interpretation of these data are actually that ratites are much younger than the breakup of Gondwana, and these birds were independently dispersed to these land masses. And the classic story before was that elephant birds were related to ostriches because of the proximity of Africa and Madagascar, but it actually turns out that elephant birds are most closely related to kiwis found in New Zealand. So an example of tremendous over ocean dispersal that led to these two very different looking animals. Around the same time and close to kind of when the burst of diversification of all birds occurred, we also have two representatives of or two groups of Malagasy lineages that are incredibly different looking. They were phylogenetic mysteries for a long time. So the mesites and the cuckoo rollers don't look like pretty any other birds around, not just in Madagascar, but across the globe. And so it was really hard to figure out what they were closely related to. And even today, we think there is no close relative. The closest relatives they had were at least 60 million years old. And both of these are in their own order. So the cuckoo roller is a single species that has that's in its own family in its own order. And mesites are three different species on Madagascar that are all in their own order. We even though so one of the explanations for why they might have failed to diversify is possibly that once lineages get to islands, it's very hard to then be able to leave islands to recolonize continental areas. And so often we think of island groups as evolutionary dead ends. They don't really have the potential to keep evolving except in the space that they're in. And I also want to point out that even though they're only in Madagascar, they're not necessarily low and they're only one species or three species. They still are abundant in their populations. So we did see quite a lot of cuckoo rollers in the places that we were in Madagascar. Mesites are harder to see because they're skulky, but we did hear a lot of them. So their population numbers are okay, so they are thriving in that way, but interestingly enough, have not changed much in the last several million years. About 40 million years ago, there were two groups, the Ascides and the ground rollers, and these diversified kind of in an intermediate amount, so about 4 species and 5 species, respectively. But more recently, about 20 to 15 million years ago, is when you start seeing the vangas and the tetrakas that I talked about before, and the other large radiation kuas. And so maybe there was something interesting happening around this time that allowed the lineages that were able to get to Madagascar during this time to diversify even more rapidly. And then finally, in the last 3 million years or so, in the recent past, we have a number of lineages that have gotten to Madagascar and have just remained single lineages. So, excuse me. We wanted to take all of this information of when birds got to Madagascar and how they got to Madagascar to look at what the patterns might be that might explain some aspect of their diversification. And so the first question we asked was, how did birds disperse to Madagascar? And the most obvious response is probably from Africa, right? So the proximity of Africa makes it most likely that most birds came from there. But it also has some little islands surrounding it in the Indian Ocean and at parts of Asia that are much further away. And so if we look at all of the lineages that we know that are endemic to Madagascar, we actually find that only about a third of these species that are in Madagascar originated from Africa. And about a third of them originated from Asia. And a third of them, it's unclear. This might be because they're really old lineages and we can't figure out, we don't have a good sense of what their closest relatives are, or because their closest relatives are actually found much more broadly across the globe. So this is a bit surprising given that given the proximity of Africa versus Asia, but still kind of interesting in terms of the dynamics of what might be happening across the Indian Ocean. And as I mentioned before, one reason why there might be fewer things coming from Africa might be because of wind patterns. And so we know that throughout across the Cenozoic, in the beginning part of the Cenozoic, the wind patterns were going from west to east, and in the somewhere in the middle of the Miocene, there was a shift that caused wind patterns to go from east to west. And so, do the wind patterns explain when, where, and when species arrived? And does that tell us something about diversification? So, if we look at birds that came in the first part of the Cenozoic versus the later part of the Cenozoic, we actually find, kind of contrary to what our expectation would be about wind patterns, that there are fewer species coming from Africa at that time, even though wind conditions were more favorable. And about a little more than half coming from the later part of the Cenozoic, even though wind conditions would have been unfavorable. So maybe there's something about the kind of catastrophic events that lead to dispersal events being playing a bigger role. What's also interesting is that the representation from Asia is fairly constant over this time period, and even given how distant that area is. What about diversification? Well, what we find is that, as we would predict, species that got to Madagascar earlier are able to diversify and radiate more. But what's surprising is that there's a little less than half of these lineages that have failed to diversify as well. And that's unexpected. I think people here are probably starting to think at this point, well, maybe one explanation could be extinction. Maybe we're not seeing that there were some diversification within these lineages, and maybe these went extinct. And that's a possibility. Given what we know about recent extinctions in Madagascar, we don't see evidence for a lot of species to have gone extinct that might change the patterns here. There are obviously quite a few things that went extinct when humans arrived on Madagascar, but we don't think that that's the explanation for why so many lineages have failed to diversify. So Madagascar is the fourth largest island. And what I want to also show you in our talk is how much of how we understand diversification patterns and evolution on Madagascar can be explained by both island biogeography expectations, but also because it's a large island and has a lot of diversity in its environments, Madagascar also acts like a continent and allows diversification within its within the island, and that can also be an important explanation for the patterns we see. So one of the kind of classic predictions in biogeography is that we can actually predict how much species richness, how many species can be supported on a landmass given its area. And so if we take the area of islands and plot that against the number of species that are found on those islands, we get a pretty good correlation across most islands in the world. But here's Madagascar, this dot here, which is well off the regression line, right? So what's going on there? Why are there fewer species than we would expect given how big this island is? One explanation is that, again, a lot of things might have gone extinct, and there has been extinction on Madagascar, but given what we know about what we have found in terms of subfossils, that doesn't necessarily explain why there's such a tremendously, why there's much lower numbers of species on Madagascar than expected. So we wanted to ask, maybe we're not detecting all of these species. Maybe the one explanation could be that we just the taxonomy is poor and not able to um, really encompass all the true diversity of Madagascar. Maybe this needs some revisions. So we, again, using mammals as an example of how this could be a real problem, or to contrast the birds with the mammals, what I'm showing you here is an example using mouse lemurs. These are the smallest primates in the world, and they're in 1992, there were just 2 known species, but over time, with more systematic surveys and genetic data, more systematic analyses, both in the field and in the lab, we now recognize 24 species of mouse lemurs. And all of these, we are, as we plot out the patterns, are known to be, to have this pattern of microendemism that fits models of watersheds and river barriers and river and um, um, elevational barriers that show that these species have been isolated in smaller areas within Madagascar, leading to these hypotheses of what these microendemism areas are. Birds, for the longest time, people have kind of ignored them in these analyses of microendemism within Madagascar, because a lot of people kind of dismiss birds as, well, they can fly, so they're not going to have small scale patterns. Well, ornithologists will tell you that birds do fly, yes, but that doesn't mean that they fly everywhere. And oftentimes you can have birds that have a very limited um, behaviors that that make them also stay within pretty restricted areas. Yeah. So we set out to look at whether there is some phylogeographic patterns within species, to see if we're missing anything, if we're missing any distinct species in our taxonomy. And what I'm showing you here are 3 different studies that all are taking specimens, samples of birds from throughout their range, and looking at whether there are distinct genetic differences between them. And in the first one, Newtonia, well, we discovered a new species here, where the southern population in green is much more genetically differentiated than the central and northern populations in the eastern humid forest. In the middle here, we have Shetba rufa, and what we're finding here, this is the this is 2 populations in the east, in the humid east, and in the dry deciduous forests of the west. And these again have been isolated for several million years, and show no signs of intermixing over those years. And so again, new species that separates these 2 populations. And then the last example, Berniaria, which is the long-billed tetraka. This is kind of an interesting example where, again, there's a southern group and a northern group that are quite genetically distinct, as well as this widespread group where there are individuals in the western part as well as in the eastern part, and found in other parts of Madagascar that comprise a clade of their own. This is an interesting example, because if you look at these specimens in museums, they really don't look that different. It's really hard to separate them out. But if you look at them genetically, there's quite a lot of deep genetic divergence that indicates that they've been isolated for several million years. And so some of these patterns that we're finding will take a deeper dive and take more information. And maybe there will be some more morphological information. In some cases, there are easy to identify morphological differences between these new species, and in some cases, it's much more cryptic. So the patterns that we've uncovered, again, point to the complexity of how birds have diversified on Madagascar. And given the analyses we've done most immediately, we're finding some loose patterns. There seems to be some pattern of a north and a south division, but where along the north and the south might vary depending on the ecologies of the birds. And there is some east-west divisions, but again, this gets complicated. It's not an easy congruent pattern to point to. So we can't necessarily support any of the proposed models of microendemism in Madagascar, but this might be because we're just at the beginning of really analyzing these patterns. We've only just started to do this. But what I will say that is interesting is that just in the two families that we've been analyzing, in the Vangas and the Bernierids, we've already described 8 new species in just these two groups. And so that tells us that there's quite a lot of potential for new species discovery in Madagascar as we go systematically through and survey both in the field and in the lab. We also wanted to look at how these groups evolve, right? And again, pointing to these classic studies of Darwin's finches and Hawaiian honeycreepers that have really been able to diversify in incredible ways. How did they do that compared to what their ancestors likely looked like? We can use their closest relatives outside of their home range to really figure that out. And some of the studies that have come out about Darwin's finches and Hawaiian honeycreepers really point to this, this pattern where these two adaptive radiations, you can see it more clearly here with the Hawaiian honeycreepers in this blue polygon. So this is a study where they looked at the bill variation in Hawaiian honeycreepers, Darwin's finches, and their closest relatives. And what they're showing is that the Hawaiian honeycreepers occupy a part of the morphospace, the morphological variation, in ways that are completely different than their closest relatives. And so that tells us that they adapted in ways that were outside of kind of the norm, which might be a good which again tells us that there's something different happening in the new environment that they faced when they got to these islands. So the expectation in adaptive radiations is that they have a greater disparity or a greater amount of variation. And so we wanted to see if Vangas also displayed this. Another expectation for adaptive radiations is kind of what we call the early burst model. So we think that the way that a lot of adaptive radiations probably evolved is that there's an ancestral population that got to a new environment, and given these new resources, we're able to speciate quite rapidly and tremendously in the beginning. But over time, as these niches started filling up, you have kind of a slowdown in diversification. And so you should expect to see kind of this slowdown pattern, in evolutionary rates. So we set out to test whether these two patterns are detectable in Vangas and Bernierids. So what we did was we first compared Vangas and Bernierids, which are the two largest radiations, as I explained. And another reason to compare them is because we think they got to Madagascar around very similar times. And so when we look at the speciation rates and look at the speciation rates over time, we see that it fits that pattern of kind of a rapid and high speciation rate early in their evolution that slows down over time. So they both have the same pattern, and this is what we should expect to get to see when we if they fit the pattern of early burst. So this is a pattern that we see in molecular evolution. Sorry, I was just checking the chat. And in terms of morphological variation and ecological diversification, vangas are interesting because they we know that their closest relatives outside of Madagascar are gleaners. They get their prey by gleaning or just kind of catching them from their substrate. But in Madagascar, we have groups of birds that do slightly different behaviors in terms of catching their prey. We have salliers that primarily are catching their prey on the wing. They're going out and catching them as they're flying. And we have probers. So like the sickle-bill vanga I was talking about, they're actually using their bills to probe through bark. And this is a fairly novel behavior for any of these, any of the birds in this clade. So we set out to characterize morphological variation, and we're able to show that there's, so we were able to use museum specimens in ways that are, that really allow us to characterize as much of the morphological variation as possible. And I was really fortunate that I had a tremendous amount of students who were interested in this and helping this with this. I think I'm running low on time, so I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can. So what we find here, vangas are the blue dots in both graphs. And what you can see is both in terms of size and in shape, they are much more variable in size and occupy a different part of shape space than their closest relatives. So definitely fitting that pattern of shift. We also used CT scans and looked at the different body parts. And the solid line is the polygon, the disparity of the Malagasy vangas, and the dashed line are the non-Malagasy vangas. And what you can see is that the solid line in all of these different parts is much greater than the dashed line. Now you might be thinking, well, what about these crazy extreme examples? Are they driving the signal? And so what we did here in the upper right was we took out the extreme species and used the variation of the others to plot, and then added back the extreme ones and see where they fit in there. And even without the extreme representatives, we still find that the Malagasy vangas are much greater, have much greater disparity. And so this is a really good test of just how much adaptive radiations can evolve in different ways than their close relatives. But what we also found that was a little bit surprising was using morphological evolution variation. This is a phylogeny, and what I want you what you should be noticing here is just that the colors of the branches change. And so when the colors change, that's showing you a different rate of evolution in those branches. And in an early burst, we should expect to see a change at this branch, which is when vangas first get to Madagascar, but instead we see it happening much later and just in these lineages. And so this is showing that in terms of morphological evolution, we don't find support for the early burst. So the clearly ways that species evolve can vary tremendously in both morphology and genetics. We also find that there's tremendously different rates of evolution in the vangas that are behaving differently, that have different foraging behaviors. And again, this is support for adaptive behavioral changes that can lead to adaptive morphological changes. So, we still have a tremendous amount of work we want to do, and we are working through. Our goal is to be able to go through all of the different lineages in Madagascar and be able to do similar analyses where we're looking at whether there's hidden diversity and looking at patterns of diversification across different types of traits. What I've shown you so far, we can draw some conclusions that are fairly interesting and unexpected, right? The biogeographic origins of the birds in Madagascar are pretty complex. They're not just a subset of the African birds, but actually there's a pretty strong influence of Asia here. We're finding that there is quite a lot of evidence of cryptic diversity, and this might lead to a fairly substantial increase in species numbers, and that can lead to subsequently changes in how we think about the conservation needs across Madagascar. And the analyses of the adaptive radiations are actually kind of much more complex than what we would expect given classic expectations. So again, this is all reasons for us to want to study this more. As I said, our future goals is try to do this with all endemic lineages, but most importantly, what I'm trying to do is find ways of using my research to support Malagasy scientists. So clearly there are aspects of what resources I have available in my institutions in the US that I can use to collaborate with my colleagues in Madagascar. And we both have questions that are complementary and can use our resources in ways that will help us together to build on our knowledge of the birds of Madagascar. And hopefully that can also lead to aspects of conservation and management. I want to acknowledge all of the people that have been tremendously useful and helpful in providing specimens, helping us collect data, funding our work, and collaborating on intellectually on all of the work that I've shown you here. And I want to leave you with some of the pictures of the people that I got to interact with in the last field trip. These people include our local field guides, our students, our the the drivers that take us from field site to field site, the gendarme that that kept us safe. It takes a village, and it really was. And we had some incredible villagers who also helped us with porting our supplies and all that. And so, really is a tremendous effort. And I am so honored that all of these people come together to help us with our work.